Well,
See you.
pretty well.
Yeah, he's driving, so
Joel.
a cardiologist Thursday and cardiac rehab.
Not here, but they,
He's got.
Yes.
Company. And that's his.
So I bought it for her to
I'll pick it
see.
up in Greenville at the Life Center,
For me?
at the hospital.
can see.
Yeah,
Thank you.
You cheering, are you cheering for the
He's
game
not back to
first?
work, is he?
of course.
He
Oh,
can do,
Frank's old
he can do
school.
fun stuff this week, but he can't travel until April.
Yeah. ACC, you know.
What is it about them? How do they stay that good?
Wait till Kathy counts the millions.
Yeah.
All mixed up, so go ahead. Sorry, I can hear it.
I guess the kids are good. The call, what he calls.
I'm sure it's always been there with them away.
Well, good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's more awake than we all were last week. A week to get used to the time change.
Yes.
I'm about to get you.
Yeah. This was always the hardest one for me.
About that.
Okay,
Asher is not used to it.
Oh,
I will tell you.
neither are our pets. They-
Yeah, they're, yeah.
Pets and kids just
Yeah.
don't realize.
No, they don't.
But it's 9 o'clock.
So what?
Yeah, exactly.
It's still light.
Right.
For those of you who weren't with us last week, we're doing a series of lessons on Jesus's last teachings while he was hanging on the cross. And last week, do y'all remember what part?
Every word.
Yeah. We talked about forgiveness.
Okay.
And the phrase that Jesus said was, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." His last words, you know, you've heard the 7 last words of Christ, and they are actually phrases, or to me, they're his last teachings, things that he felt important enough to emphasize while he was hanging on the cross. And as we talked last week, it's a little difficult to talk when you're hanging up there on the cross too. So he went to a great deal of effort to say these teachings. So they must have been important to him, and they should be important to us. Today we're going to talk about his interaction with the criminals that were hanging on the cross with him. And the phrase, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And I think we're going to learn compassion, second chances, and we're going to see a little bit of a glimpse of heaven, which is kind of interesting. I'm going to read some scripture, selected verses from Luke 23. 2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." As we talked about last week, the 7 last words or teachings or sayings, no single gospel has every one of them listed. Luke has a couple, John has a couple, Matthew and Mark only have one. But this one is only told in Luke's gospel. Luke's emphasis in his gospel is Jesus' concern for the least, the last, and the lost. He begins his gospel by highlighting Jesus' birth in a stable, the lowliest of the low, and sleeping in a manger, a feed trough for animals. And all through his gospel, he talks in Jesus' ministry of how he ministered to the poor, the riffraff, if you want to call it, the prostitutes, the people that were looked down upon. So it's kind of fitting that Luke would record one of Jesus's last conversations was with a criminal. Why do we, we're kind of associated by the company we keep, aren't we? If you hang around with riffraff, people think you're riffraff, don't they? Well, Jesus associated with sinners in life and in death. Remember, he allowed the prostitute to wash his feet with her tears. He called tax collectors and just average garden variety sinners to be his disciples. He touched lepers and he ate with unclean people. So we see this kind of association all through his ministry. In his day, people who weren't religious, I guess you'd say, felt really uncomfortable around the religious leaders. And I'm sure that's probably true today. I'm sure that Aaron, when people find out he's a minister, think, oh, I gotta be good, Well, how do we react to people like this? Do we feel like sometimes that, oh, we go to church, so we got it made.
Got it all together.
Got it all together.
I was just thinking, when you talk about the lepers, that was hitting my mind as you said. Remember how we reacted 20 years ago when the word AIDS? was
Yeah.
mentioned?
Yeah. We're afraid of something different.
And you wanted to stay miles away
Yeah.
from somebody.
Luke is also the only gospel where we find the story of Zacchaeus. Now, remember the story of Zacchaeus. We've heard it since we were little bitty kids. And we actually had a lesson on that recently. Zacchaeus was a tax collector. And unlike we weren't like tax collectors today either, but they weren't stigmatized today like they were back then. Zacchaeus, people look down on him because he sold his soul to the Romans. He bought the right to collect taxes from Rome, which allowed him to get rich at the expense of the other people, because he would, in addition to collecting the taxes for Rome, he could also add some for himself. All the tax collectors were allowed to do that.
Don't they still do that today?
But Zacchaeus, he'd heard of Jesus, and he wanted to see him for himself, But he was a short man, and some of us can identify with that. And so he was caught up in the throngs of people that were milling around trying to catch a glimpse of Jesus. So, of course, he climbed up in the tree, as we know, and so he could catch a glimpse of him. Well, as we recall, Zacchaeus, while he was up in the tree, Jesus was walking by and immediately looked up, and they were eye to eye. And he said, Zacchaeus, come down. I'm going to have supper with you tonight. Come into your house. I'm going to have supper. Eating supper with somebody in the Middle East biblical times meant you were willing to call that person your friend, which is probably true today. I don't think we'd invite our enemies to dinner, would we? But that meant you were going to have a personal relationship with them. So when Jesus said he was wanting to stay with Zacchaeus and have dinner with him, he was reaching out to him. Well, that started the little religious leaders grumbling, Why would he want to stay with somebody like that? And you can picture yourself, okay, he goes home and tells his wife, put some supper on the table immediately, and he probably invited some of his friends, maybe, his sinful friends. There might have been prostitutes there, tax collectors, thieves. And you can picture Jesus going in there and looking around and just having a good time, sitting down, talking to them, and throwing in his mission, his words about God. Just like he was in a conversation like we do around our tables on Wednesday night. We talk to each other. We express our faith, right, don't we? And then outside, the religious leaders are going around like little vultures, you know, and they're saying, look what he's doing. He's eating with those people. Good grief, what is wrong with him? But you can picture Jesus coming out and saying, you don't understand, do you? And in Luke 19:10, he says, the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. Well, that didn't really stop him, though, did it? So as he lived, associating with what these people would consider the scum of the earth, that's the way he died. 3 times in Luke, he describes the criminals with a Greek word I cannot pronounce, but it literally means those who do evil works. But Matthew and Mark describe them with another word I can't pronounce. That's a term used of armed robbers. And this is the same term that is used in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. In other words, these criminals that were hanging beside Jesus on the cross were not just your, they weren't guilty of just robbing a bank or something like that. They were mean. They would remember the story of the Good Samaritan, how the man was beaten within an inch of his life.
They didn't value life.
Right. They did not value life at all. And that's what these 2 criminals were. So they were bad. They were evil. So it's interesting that Jesus was reaching out to this type of person even at his death. So if Jesus thought it was important to reach out to the lowly, what about us? Shouldn't we do the same? Mm-hmm. Sometimes we look at somebody and think, well, you're kind of creepy, But Jesus sees beyond the outside appearance. He sees into the people's hearts. And that's what he's telling us to do. We have 2 criminals. And there's 2 responses they give to Jesus' hanging on the cross. In the first one, both criminals saw the same thing, right? They saw Jesus hanging on the cross. Jesus, who claimed to be the Messiah. They saw him being abused and made fun of and spit on and degraded. They heard him cry out, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. But these 2 criminals had 2 different responses. All 4 Gospels tell us that the criminals were on the cross with Jesus, but only Luke reports the conversations. We see that the first criminal, even as he was hanging on the cross, naked and dying, he wanted to validate himself by agreeing with the crowd, He started, hurling insults at him too. He looked at Jesus and saw a failed Messiah, a man who naively called people to love their enemies and turn the other cheek. Can you imagine? A man that claimed to be the Messiah, but refused to take up arms and fight the Romans. This criminal was angry when he heard Jesus pray, Father, forgive them. But the other criminal, he kind of, maybe he's not this imposter. Maybe there's something that I'm missing here. Maybe he thought about what he had heard Jesus say. Maybe it was the Father forgive him that caused him to have a change of heart. Or maybe he looked into Jesus' eyes and saw compassion and love. We don't know what changed his heart, but something did. Or maybe he thought, I'm going to die anyway. maybe, Jesus is my hope. He saw something that the others didn't see. So he turns around, he tells his friend on the cross, I don't know if they knew each other, maybe they did, I don't know. He says, don't you fear God? Because we're all under the same condemnation. We're all being punished the same way. But you and I have a right to be because we did something bad. This man hasn't. He hasn't done anything. Right there, you see his little bit of mustard seed faith, don't you? It's like, I know I'm wrong, but Jesus isn't. So why is he being killed? Newsflash. So then he turns to Jesus and he says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. It's a curious little word, remember. Remember me in the Bible meant help me and deliver me. And in the Old Testament, God remembered people many times. In Genesis 8:1, God remembered Noah and saved him from the flood. In Genesis also, he remembered Abraham and spared his nephew Lot from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Genesis, he remembered Rachel and opened her womb so she could have a child. In Exodus, God remembered his covenant with Abraham and delivered the Israelites from slavery. So the criminal says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Deliver me from the place of the dead. Deliver me from the prison I'm destined for. Remember me as the one who turned to you on the cross. So in this world, we still have two kinds of people who, when they think about Jesus on the cross, see nothing more than a disillusioned man, and they reject him. They don't see him as God incarnate, who gave his life for us. So we have two criminals who gave two responses. So we need to think about which thief will I be. Jesus's response is just a few words, but it's very significant. He listens to the second criminal, and he says, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. From this one simple statement, we learn important truths about life after death, God's mercy, and heaven. Let's start with the first word, today. That should give us a lot of peace if you think about it. What did Jesus mean when he said today? He meant right now. Today, this is going to happen. He didn't say, oh, I'll think about it, I'll get back to you next week. Or, well, I can't answer your question right now.
Judy, you think he meant that literally? That's one thing I've always kind of struggled with, because we think of Jesus having to endure hell for us those 3 days before he arose again and then ultimately ascended into heaven. And I have no issue with him telling the criminal that he would be with him in paradise, but did he literally mean today?
Well, there's two thoughts on that. This author says that some people think that it wasn't exactly then, but this author seems to think he meant immediately, or maybe he meant immediately when he ascended, that would be when the today would take place. But this author goes on to talk about, people who have near-death experiences. all heard of people who are at the point of death and they see themselves, they see a heaven or something, and then they come back. We don't really know. I like to think that at the point of death, our soul immediately goes up. But that's a good question. I mean, that's something that we won't know.
I think the criminal was certainly saved immediately.
Yeah,
But I just didn't understand exactly the correlation that you will be
I
with
don't know.
me today.
I don't know.
Because I thought Jesus had more work that he couldn't take anybody with him to do the work he had to do
Yeah,
those next 3 days.
I don't know. That's a good question. Well,
Well, could it be that since it's a triune God,
That's what I was getting.
you're with me,
Mhm.
the Heavenly Father,
It could be.
the Holy Spirit,
Yeah, that's a good
and I'll
point.
be along shortly.
Yeah. Save
I'll
him
be
like-
that.
Yeah.
I see him 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
And that would have been too hard for him, for the thief to
Understand
understand.
that.
But that's exactly what
Yeah.
I was getting ready to say.
Mhm.
I think that's a good point, very good point. Yeah.
In that same vein, I know that the shack is not theologically correct, but it still has a very good message.
Oh, it
If you go and
Okay.
see it,
Mhm.
you know, one of the points that Matt makes to Papa, God,
Mhm.
is how could you do this to your son? And he turns his
Mhm.
wrists over,
Mhm.
and I was there.
Yeah,
So that,
It's all one and the same.
that's true. And we have a hard time wrapping our head around the Trinity, which is another point here. Okay, the next words Jesus said, "You will be with me." This gives us the main point of Jesus' death, and his words are the great mercy that God shows. You'll notice, if you think about it, Jesus didn't say, before I can offer you salvation, I need to make sure of some things. I got to ask you these questions. Do you believe in the Trinity? Do you believe that I'm fully God and fully human? Have you been baptized?
There were no conditions.
Can you recite your catechism?
Can you say the Apostles' Creed without the congregation helping you?
Right, right. You'll notice that all these things are important. I mean, I'm not saying we don't need to do this, but they are kind of outward signs. Jesus doesn't look at the person, really. I mean, your outward signs. He looks at your heart. He's the only one that can see inside your heart and see what you believe. Now, John and I have been married long enough to know each other pretty well, but there's still, there's some things that in your heart that nobody in the world will ever know. Don't you agree?
Mhm.
I mean, but God knows everything, which is kind of scary sometimes. Isn't it? He knows every little evil thing you've ever thought about or done, or
Before you think.
yeah.
That's really discouraging.
I mean, we can hide things from each other, but we can't hide things from God. So Jesus is telling this thief that you will be with me. And Paul says in Ephesians, we are saved by grace through faith, and this not of ourselves, it is the gift of God. So this thief, he had not been brought up as a Christian. He didn't know the Christian doctrine, but he had faith the size of a mustard seed. And that was enough for Jesus to say, today you will be with me in paradise. We like to sometimes put ourselves on a little pedestal because we're churchgoers. And we like to think, well, I know where I'm going to be, but look at that scruffy little person there. But it's not up to us to judge who gets in and who doesn't, right? That's Jesus and God and the Trinity, all the three, that makes that decision. The last few words of this, well, before I get to the last few words though, this is another prime example of, we've heard about deathbed confessions.
Mhm.
It's never too late, is it? And Jesus made this very plain in this particular instance, that it's never too late. You can do all kinds of evil things all your life, and at the last moment, say, forgive me, Lord. And that's what Jesus was showing this criminal. Although I don't advise us waiting till it's too late, but but that's part of it. Jesus showed that even somebody who's been done awful things deserves a second chance. Are we willing to give people a second chance today? Sometimes we're not. The promise of Jesus's words are found in the last two words, in paradise. Today you'll be with me in paradise. So when you hear the word paradise, what do you think of that? Not Paradise Island. It's used so loosely today, isn't it? To me, it's I've always thought the Garden of Eden was heaven. That's my idea of heaven. To me, I feel closer to God in nature than anywhere else, because you're seeing his creation. But the Greek word for paradise comes from a Persian word that was used in ancient times to refer to the king's garden. The king's garden was a walled garden that was beautiful. I mean, you think about some of the beautiful gardens of Charleston or Biltmore or something, and it probably even surpassed those. And sometimes it might have had a menagerie in it with little animals. I'd have to have animals around me in heaven. I don't know about y'all. But
Love's like to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning.
yes.
Don't let them out.
And it would have,
Can you
like,
tell what I did this week?
it would have, lakes or waterfalls, or, just think of something that's absolutely gorgeous. The king's garden. Imagine spending eternity in the king's garden without hate or violence or stress or anxiety or politics. We all have our own mental picture of heaven, I think. But there's a little story in here that I think is really comforting. There was a doctor who made house calls back in the day. Well, this was a long time ago, because he took his dog with him and his horse and buggy. So one day he went on a house call to a dying man. And he went in the man's house. His little dog stayed on the front steps. The dying man said to the doctor, "Doc, what's it going to be like? Heaven? What will it be like?" And at that exact moment, the doctor's dog began to scratch at the door and whine and whimper. So the doctor stopped and he said, "Do you hear that?" And the man replied, "Yes." The doctor continued, "That's my dog. He's never been inside your house. He doesn't know what it's like on the other side of this door. All he knows is that his master is in here. And if his master is in here, it must be okay." So I think that's a good thing to think about. The Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot about heaven, although in the book of Revelation it gives us a little bit of glimpses, but Revelation is really symbolic, and it's kind of confusing, and it doesn't really give you a lot. But we do know that Jesus describes heaven as the king's gardens, paradise. And we know that he will be there, so it must be okay. Over time, the word paradise came to be used of the Garden of Eden by the Jewish people. So Eden was, if you think about it, it was the king's garden, the garden of God. And Adam and Eve had it made. And what did they do? They were expelled from the garden because they disobeyed God. So from thereafter, human beings were forbidden from ever entering the garden again. And paradise was lost to humankind. John's gospel uses a lot of imagery. He tells us that Jesus prayed in the garden of Gethsemane. He was crucified in a garden at Calvary. And he was buried in a garden next to Calvary. He also tells us that when Jesus was raised from the dead, Mary Magdalene saw him and thought he was a gardener. And what this author believes John was saying is that Luke was hinting through Jesus' words spoken to this dying man that Jesus was opening the door to the king's garden once more. Through his suffering, death, and resurrection, Jesus was removing the curse that had banished humankind from this garden, from paradise. And he was inviting us to return to paradise with him. And who was the first person he invited to join him in paradise? A hardened criminal, a thief on the cross. Today you will be with me in paradise. These words point us toward Jesus' mission and ours to seek and save those who are lost. And this includes the hopeless people. Sometimes we can be pretty hopelessly lost too, you know. We can drift away. These words point us toward the paradise that was restored by Jesus on the cross and remind us of the promise we have of dwelling in the King's garden with him. Any questions?
Just one comment, unrelated to the lesson. Kathy mentioned the movie The Shack. If any of you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's an amazing movie. It's not totally biblically correct, but if anything can ever show you examples of truly the love of God and judgment and just so many teachings of the Bible and bring it to life. I think you'll all really enjoy it.
It's well worth watching. And the scene in the garden, when he's first walking through it, and he says, oh, this is a mess. And she says, well, this is you. And then later, when they plant the tree and you have the aerial view, it's perfect. Just a beautiful, beautiful garden where life springs forth.
If anybody happened to have read the book, always the movie is a real letdown to any book.
Yep.
But this one is not.
The shack.
It's good. It really is good.
Any more questions?
Y'all are quiet today.
Help me out with these.
You don't need help.
You making this claim? Real?
Well, let us pray then. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I want to be with you in paradise. Help me to reach out to and to love the unlovable, the unclean, the people that are looked down upon, so that they too might see your love through me. Amen. Next week, we're going to do Behold Your Son, Behold Your Mother.
Can I give y'all an update on my friend Susie? I sent it to you, but I don't know if you talked about it. She's the one that's fighting cancer, and they gave her a year to live. She has been accepted in another trial of medication, and I was talking to my college roommate yesterday who had just spoken to Susie the day before, and I said, you know, Susie's been through so much. I said, maybe her life, maybe her purpose in life is not to live and beat this, but to find a way for someone else to live.
That's,
And she said, and my roommate Gina said, Susie said exactly the same thing to me yesterday. That even if I don't live, maybe what they learned from me will save someone.
Judy, thank you so much. That was a great lesson.
Well,